Welcome everybody to this webinar on helping your students with imposter syndrome. I'm Jonathan Aragon. Pleasure to meet you. And here with me today is Shamini Diaz, the Director of Preparing Future Faculty. And also, I have the pleasure of joining with me today, Patrick Martin. He's a psychotherapist and for the LA County and for private practice, and CEO of the Mental Health ToolBox. And Patrick, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everyone. Hope everyone's having a good day. Good week so far. I know it's just getting started. Like my brother just said, I am a psychotherapist. I have about 10 years experience as a clinical social worker with LA County Mental Health. I have a part-time private practice, and I have my passion projects, blog, YouTube, podcast with the Mental Health Toolbox. So I was asked on today to see if I could add any value. I hope I can with this topic in particular, which I think is an excellent topic when we're talking about students who are establishing their expectations for their careers and moving forward. So I'm happy to be here today. Thank you so much for allowing me to share what I can.
I just want to chime in and welcome Patrick and Jonathan and thank them for co-hosting this. I think this is a very important topic. Graduate school is an interesting space. We're forming our identities. We're forming how we want to move forward, and imposter syndrome lives large among us. So thank you all for coming to this webinar. Unfortunately, I have to run because I am teaching in a few minutes. So I will be leaving, but I'm sure you'll have a great session. And remember, always questions, during and after the session. If you want to follow up with all of this, do let Jonathan know, and we can work with you, bring on more topics that maybe come out of this big one. Right? There are many subtopics in here that we might be interested to explore. So enjoy the session, learn a lot, and I'll see you all at another webinar. And thank you again, Patrick, for being the co-host with Jonathan today.
Oh,
and
my pleasure. It's an honor to meet you, Ms. Diaz.
I'll see everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shamini. I also noticed Tamar is with us. Tamar has taught some courses for us in the past, and she will be offering a webinar this semester. Great. All right, so I did share a link. Oh, yep, Tamar says hi, folks, in the chat.
Hey,
Tamar. Tamar also does a lot of research and journalistic stuff on the Free Britney movement, so be sure to check that out. So I shared in the chat the slides for today in case anybody would like them, and I also put in Patrick's link tree. If you're interested, he has a lot of great stuff online, so please check that out. Before we get started, I just wanted to go through the Zoom guidelines for today. Transcript is now enabled. So if you want to see the transcript of the words that are being said, if that helps you at all, down below on the Zoom toolbar on the bottom, just click live transcript and you'll be able to adjust the size of the text however that fits your needs. As far as participation goes, the participation is completely open in this webinar. So feel free to contribute to the conversation, ask questions at any point during the webinar, and you can do so in chat, out loud, however you feel comfortable. In terms of just reducing In terms of reducing Zoom fatigue, just some quick notes. If you don't want to look at yourself the whole time for the whole hour, there's a little kebab icon next to your grid screen. It will say mute, and then it will be like 3 dots. So if you click that, you can go to hide self view if you don't want to stare all day in a mirror, or at least for the next hour. You can also adjust the grid or the window in which you see other people's faces, and also keep distance from you and your laptop to try to recreate a natural distance that happens in real life. And as far as video goes, I love having your video on. I love to see all your wonderful faces. It's very engaging, but I also know that everyone's got different circumstances. So feel free to have your video off too, on or off. It's just whatever your comfort level is. Okay, so the essential question for today is, how can early intervention for perceived fraudulence transform higher education and lead to greater collective success and well-being? The agenda for today is going to shake down as follows. We're going to talk about what imposter syndrome is and help with that foundational understanding. Then we're going to discuss why it's important to address it in higher education, actual tactics, things that we can do to address it in higher education and in other settings, and the bigger picture are the opportunity, which will be how is this unfolding, in our society as a whole, and if we're being future focused about higher education, how is addressing this also very important. All right, and just to prime our thinking about the topic, if you could just go ahead and share 1 or 2 words in the chat or out loud. When you think of imposter syndrome, what comes to mind? Just 1 or 2 words of what pops to mind. Unqualified. They'll find me out. Second guessing. Inadequate. Not feeling worthy, knowledgeable, or capable. Asking for help. Self-doubt and underestimated. Not enough. Yeah. Performance anxiety. Missing information. Not deserving of success. New project. That's an interesting one. Maybe anxiety about new project. Unreal expectations for individual performance. Nice. Thank you all for being willing to share that. I think a lot of what's been said here is very reminiscent of the rumination, the thought process that goes on, and the fears related to imposter syndrome. And we'll definitely see some of this. In fact, here's a quote that might represent some of those words, those things that popped to mind that you shared. The exaggerated esteem in which my life work is held makes me feel very ill at ease. I feel compelled to think of myself as an involuntary swindler. Anybody seen this quote before? Have any idea who might have said this? This was said by Albert Einstein, Nobel laureate, someone who is widely acknowledged to be one of the greatest physicists of all time. Yet from this quote, it seems like Albert Einstein did struggle with imposter syndrome. We've heard similar things said by notable people of power and influence, such as Michelle Obama, Dr. Margaret Chan, Maya, A-list actors, famous comedians and musicians, champion athletes, well-known CEOs, and best-selling authors. I like this quote from Seth Godin. Yes, you're an imposter, and so am I. And so is everybody else. Superman still lives on Krypton, and the rest of us are just doing our best. So why did I share those quotes with you? First of all, because I want to highlight the fact that there are plenty of examples of very successful people that have struggled with imposter syndrome. So I just want to start off by removing any stigma that imposter syndrome would preclude anybody from being successful in life. Likewise, I also feel it's important to highlight that having imposter syndrome is not a prerequisite to being successful in life either. It's merely something that some people struggle with. And like any barriers in life, success and good health are simultaneously achieved when we understand those barriers, we acknowledge them, and we address them head on. Imposter syndrome is also not limited to people who are highly successful. Anyone can view themselves as an imposter if they fail to internalize their success. In fact, it's estimated that 70% of people will have at least one episode of imposter syndrome in their lives. Usually when we're faced with a new environment or a challenging situation, such as a new position at work. And anyone can actually be an imposter when they display a facade or present public self that is different from their perceived self in order to meet social expectations. So just to the focus of this webinar, though, is not, the situations in which we might feel like false imposters sometimes in certain circumstances, or the discrepancy between our private self and our public self, but more or less imposter syndrome as it's most commonly known, to where it's a pervasive struggle in somebody's life that leads to a lot of psychological distress. And yeah. So just to frame our understanding a little bit more, here are some other facts that might help. False imposters have a subjective experience of fraudulence, regardless of the views of objective observers. So when there's evidence to the contrary of being an imposter, they still feel like one. That's different from a real imposter. A real imposter takes on a false identity in order to deceive others, and the degree of that misrepresentation would be unacceptable if detected. So there's a clear difference between false imposters and real ones. And I would also like to note that imposter syndrome is not a display of false modesty. So humility is something that's considered to be a positive attribute in people, but the kind of difficulty accepting the praise of others that we see in people with imposter syndrome is a very different thing. It's also not a pathological disease, nor is it a personality disorder, and it's not something that people are diagnosed with typically. Um, Rather, it interferes with the psychological well-being of a person. Okay. Now that we got those things out of the way, when it comes to understanding what imposter syndrome is, uh, here's the imposter cycle proposed by Clance, 1985. And this shows that somebody that struggles with imposter syndrome, it usually begins when they're presented with an achievement-related task, such as a homework assignment or work task. And then they have fears of inadequacy or fears of being discovered as a fraud, self-protective behavior that triggers this anxiety and worry, resulting in either over preparation or procrastination, and then a feeling of relief when the task is achieved, and then discounting the positive feedback, attributing it to either that over preparation, the hard work involved, or luck if one procrastinates for a long time and then happens to pull through. And then that contributes to the feeling of fraudulence. And then it continues again when another task is presented to them. And so, Patrick, I'm going to open this up to you to talk a little bit more about it.
Sure. Can everyone hear me okay? Good. All right. So I don't know about you guys. I'm very visual. So I love it. I love it when there's these like infographics. It's kind of like Instagram now, and you always see like the the depictions of what's going on in charts. And I think this is done very well. And this being identified, 1985, I think they did a really good job in terms of kind of showing the process, because as a therapist, this really speaks to what maladaptive thought process looks like in general. And so, and with the research too, if you dive into this, what Clance and those after her identified is that there is a strong correlation or comorbidity of anxiety and depression that go along with this imposter syndrome or fraudulence, whatever you want to call it. It's this pervasive idea that no matter what happens, there's always the risk of being found out, or that somehow we get lucky, or there's some automatic negative thought that prevents us from breaking this cycle. And so what I love here is if you look at the achievement related tasks, that box on the top left, this is kind of what we think of as an activating event, right? So this is kind of the end of what we accomplished, but it's also the beginning or the resting phase between the next task. And I think when this presentation was started, one of you chimed in with new goal, new task as kind of when you think about imposter syndrome. And yes, absolutely, because that is the beginning of the next spiral, right? The cognitive spiral that you'll see with someone who has that level of self-doubt, those intrusive thoughts that put us into a tailspin. And you'll see it's labeled here, even anxiety, self-doubt, and worry. We think about anxiety, we think about things like catastrophizing, making mountains out of molehills, self-deprecation. And that starts the cycle here and the behavior. So we have the activating event, which would be the achievement. Okay, we're coming down from that. Now we're presented with a new task. That starts the process of the compensatory behavior. Oftentimes what we call it in clinical terms. The compensatory behavior is that behavior we engage in to relieve the anxiety, right? So in this case, it's one of two things, right? It's either over preparation or procrastination, right? But even with the procrastination, what you'll see even in the research is that is piggybacked by cramming, right? Or hustling. right? To feel prepared, even though you procrastinated. So the procrastination would be like the avoidance of the discomfort with what is set before you, the new task, the new expectation. And that could also be over preparation. I think if you look at this diagram, you'll see that even the over preparation could be the cramming following the procrastination. But in either case, there's a feeling of relief once you feel prepared or once you accomplish that thing, right? And that the reason for that is not just because you accomplished the thing, but it's the feedback you get from the environment. It's that validation that says, oh, you did a good job, you know, but nobody else knows what you know, in the sense that all of the angst you went through to get that done, or to prepare, or to cram, or all the grief you put yourself through in order to make that come to fruition, all they see is the outcome. And because all they see is the outcomes, you just get that pat on the back, that attaboy, good job, that validation, that now it solidifies this notion that in order to get the same kind of positive feedback, I have to repeat that same process. I have to put myself through that same turmoil in order to get the same outcome. It just reinforces that whole process, right? And so the perceived fraudulence is increased, right? Because it's like, oh, well, if they only knew what I went through to get that done, if they only knew that it was a struggle for me, they wouldn't think so highly of me. They wouldn't think so highly of the outcome, right? And so when it comes to the notion of like impression management, then it almost creates a bigger wedge between us and transparency, because if we can't be open about what a big of a struggle that was necessarily, because then people might assume that maybe because this didn't come easy to us, somehow we would be a fraud. Does that make sense? So I think whoever put this together, Clance, 10 years ago, they were spot on with this process. And I think in terms of implications, it's really important that we understand what the point of intervention is. If looking at this diagram, just kind of thinking about this from a sequential point of view, where do you think a point of intervention would be? If you had to disrupt this process, what do you think would be the easiest place to kind of get a foothold?
Discount positive feedback.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. That's a great place. So as with anything, there's usually multiple points of intervention. And that's a great one. Because what we do see, and then this is just in therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, I mean, it's all pretty much the same, whether you look at it from a CBT point of view or a solution focused or just life skills in general. But in CBT, we coin it as negative filtering, right? So the propensity is to minimize the positive and blow up the small things. Meaning, like if your boss comes over or your teacher comes over and they give you some critical feedback on an assignment that you turned in your head, you might be thinking, oh, they think I'm this horrible student, or I'm this horrible employee, or they just hired me and then now I've let them down. And it's easy to get into that frame of mind. But if somebody pays you a compliment and praises your work, right, it's easy to mitigate it, to minimize, to discount that credit. And then this is more than being modest. It's actually the belief that no matter what anybody says, I'm not good enough. They just don't know me well enough, right? The problem with this, other than your self-esteem and the extra work you're putting out to feel like you have to over-prepare, the problem is the nonverbal boundaries you're setting with people. The person who discounts positive feedback is in effect communicating to other people what your boundary is, that they can see you're physically uncomfortable with compliments. And when people sense that from you, what happens is they will start to respect that boundary. meaning they'll stop complimenting you as much. They will stop even engaging you if they see that you're uncomfortable or even socially anxious. But in particular, for the person who is being praised for their work, if you shut down, then they're going to stop praising you. And consequently, subsequently, what happens is then there's this even a bigger imbalance between the positive feedback and what you're blowing up in your head as negative or critical feedback. And it's because the negative feedback can't stop, because that's part of the corrective experience in life, right? From those in authority, those appraising our work, that never ends. That can't be minimized. But when we minimize the positive, it creates a greater chasm between the two, which further polarizes that view in our own head about our own sense of adequacy, competency. So absolutely, that would be a great place to kind of work on accepting positive feedback and asking follow-up questions. It would be like, oh, what did you like about my work? What really stood out to you? Where do you think I did a good job on this? What do you think I can improve upon? And then even taking positive feedback and seeking out areas to improve upon, and exercising that muscle of soliciting feedback from people will counteract and contradict the impulse to avoid. So that's a fantastic point of intervention. Anywhere else in this diagram that might stand out to you as a place where you could get a foothold, change the dynamic?
We had some people say
yes.
that achievement related tasks, and also as soon as the problem is perceived. And also Tamara has a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Tamara says, how do we communicate with internal monologue telling us not that seeking feedback is being too needy or opportunistic?
Absolutely. I love that monologue. I always say internal dialogue, right? Or mental gymnastics, but I like monologue. I'm going to steal that. So yeah, the internal monologue, right? Of wondering like, how will I be perceived if I seek feedback from my environment, right? And here's the thing, people with imposter syndrome, whatever you want to call it, or propensity toward that state of mind, they're already tend to be the type of personality that wants to please. They want, because they're seeking that validation. So it would be easy for the person who has this level of insecurity, self-doubt, fear to feel that if they seek feedback, then they're somehow going to be perceived as overreaching. But let me tell you, the trick here is to understand that when you think you're yelling, you're whispering. And that's true for everyone. When we think we are the squeaky wheel, we're really barely being heard. You know, in the classroom, outside the classroom, in the world. And in the sense that when we're trying to get feedback, when we're trying to sharpen our saw, the most important thing to do is to ask questions. I can't remember who said it, but famous quote says, a level of our success in life can be determined by the type of questions we ask. Right. And by that I mean by seeking honest feedback about our performance, which can be tricky because it's easy to make other people our mirror. And that is not what we want to do with anxiety, meaning that we put all of our stock into somebody else's opinion. But it's important to get comfortable with the discomfort of asking questions. And oftentimes that breaks the ice and the avoidance pattern that we would normally have, and just feeling like we need to blend in and do enough and not be seen and get the job done so we can be seen as efficient. right? Because if we ask too many questions, there's the fear that somehow they will know that we don't have all the answers and we shouldn't be there, right? Hence we're a fraud. So to answer your question, how do we get past that monologue? We don't give ourselves time to question it. When you catch yourself getting in your own way, you have to take a leap, because we can talk ourselves out of just about anything, including asking for help. And so the trick is to act and not get pulled into that monologue before we get in our own way. And just get comfortable with being the first one to ask a question, or challenging yourself to be the first one in class to ask questions. I try and practice this with my daughter, who's in middle school, and she's been timid since she was little. I tell her, be the first one to raise your hand in class, even if it's a question you already know the answer to. Not because you need to know the answer, but because you want to build the habit of speaking up. It's really about the habit of just getting comfortable with engagement and not how you're perceived by your peers. That's where we get stuck, is when we get too caught up in what we think other people are thinking about us. That's called the spotlight effect. When you feel like everybody's focused on you, or other people are thinking about you, and it's judgmental. In psychology, it's called reflected appraisals. In the general terms, the spotlight effect. So we're trying to understand that everybody feels that way to an extent, and to get past ourselves and just get comfortable with engagement and not caught up so much in what we think other people are thinking about us. I don't know if that helps.
Tamar said, thank you.
You're welcome.
And Linda asked if these are often students who ask too many questions or make too many comments.
There's a difference between asking questions to seek attention or excessive validation because you already know the answers. And also reading the room. This is the tricky part of life in general, is learning to read the room and throttle yourself, meaning that being respectful of other people's time, of course, also being aware of your own motivations, and also impression management. So on one hand, if you fear that you're going to be seen as the quiet one in the classroom, then you might have to go against the grain and ask a few questions to break the ice. But at the same time, you don't want to overuse that strategy, because that could shift the impression the opposite direction. So really, it has to do a lot with what your motivation is. And I can tell you that it doesn't matter what people think, but in some circumstances it does. And because that has a direct impact on how you're perceived. Absolutely. And if something is perceived to be real, it can sometimes be real in its consequences. You can get on somebody's bad side, real quick if you're not careful, but you can also get back on their good side. And so that's the thing about impression, is checking in with yourself and reading the room enough to know that if you are overdoing it, right, with the questions. And if, being a little more savvy about it, like if you have a real need for additional questions and feedback, taking the time to write those things down, and then approaching the teacher or that person or that boss at a more appropriate time, so that you're not rejecting yourself, and you're not completely containing, you're just being more savvy about how you go about it. Right? Does that help? Yeah. Oh, and yes, Aubrey, the idea of impression management actually comes from Goffman. He's a sociologist. He had something called stage theory. So it might be a good read if you want to Google that, stage theory, Goffman. It's interesting.
And when it comes to like trying to identify with your students, it could be a little bit tricky, since a lot of it happens like underneath the surface. But usually it's an issue with deadlines. So if deadlines continue to be a problem, even though time management related interventions are taking place, it's probably because it's resulting from some of these other fears that need to be understood and addressed, and also really high levels of anxiety when it comes to academic performance. So we'll talk about that with some like classroom strategies a little bit further down in today's webinar. But really, another point of intervention from the professor's point of view is to really try to create a classroom environment that makes it a lot more safe to fail, that doesn't stack really high risk assignments. So you have a lot of scaffolding points of formative feedback along the way, so that all your grade is not dependent upon one performance that leads a lot of room for perfectionism to ensue. And then being really creative about many interventions that you can do to try to relieve your students' anxiety. Because one of the things that should be noted about this imposter cycle is this doesn't mean that students are unable to turn in their assignments or they're unable to succeed. They do. And as we see that some people that struggle with the imposter phenomenon are high achieving, it just comes at a cost to a lot of psychological distress. And so when we're trying to improve well-being in higher education, which has become very much more of a focus since since our new norm has taken place, this is some ways we can achieve that. So can you tell us a little bit more about your question on to speak from the instructor's point of view as well as the student's point of view? You mean if an instructor is struggling with this, or you mean in terms of working with students that might be struggling with this?
Well, I was actually asking if there are signals that as instructors we should look for that might indicate, and we may be oblivious, that the student is struggling with this syndrome. And that's why I asked the question, is this, are there signals? Like, is it the student who asks too many inane questions? And how do we go about structuring our class so that it's comfortable for these students who have this syndrome? And it sounds like it's just connected to their personality. And many times when you're new with students, it's very hard to make the determination if they have some of these underlying problems that we could help them with. And so I'm hearing it from a person's perspective as to what it feels like. But as an instructor, I was wondering if there are certain cues we can look for in order to incorporate our classroom and our classroom instruction to accommodate and help these students rather than fill them with anxiety.
Yeah, let me just jump to some of those strategies then to answer your question, and then I'll have Patrick talk a little bit more about impression management.
Thank you.
There's been different definitions proposed and characteristics to some agreement and disagreement. But I do like this term a little bit better, perceived fraudulence, that gets away from thinking about it as a personality disorder, a psychological disorder, or having it being confused with real imposter syndrome. So you might hear me use this term perceived fraudulence a little bit. And that's really the idea behind it. Okay. So when it comes to like interventions in the classroom, if you look at Fink's taxonomy here, we have the typical like learning outcomes you might see in the green. And then you have these other dimensions of learning outcomes in the blue. So teaching people how to learn, how they learn, how it works best for them. And we also have these dimensions of caring and the human dimension. So really looking for opportunities in your class to go beyond just the understanding of the subject material at hand or the profession related competencies to providing opportunities for people to sort out their own feelings, interests, and values. And one way you can do this is having opportunities for reflection. So that might be with portfolio keeping or thinking about yourself in the future, or connecting perhaps the assignments with your own values and reflexive thinking, thinking about your influence on other people and how you see yourself in society, making your own unique contributions, learning about oneself and others. So in essence, it's bringing a human dimension into the classroom so that we can balance rewards with things that human beings actually value, so that everything is not so stacked on the importance of the task itself. Because we know that false, fake imposters, it's triggered, with that achievement related task, right? So if we can really take the air out of that task, like take the importance away from the task and focus a little bit more on things we actually care about as human beings, then I think some of that anxiety can be alleviated. Another one is to have opportunities in your classroom for people to talk about themselves in a way that's comfortable and talk about struggles that we have. It might even be you as the professor, like in maybe small and professional ways, revealing your own flaws so that you can get rid of this sort of iceberg type scenario. Because another thing that happens with false imposters is this idea that, everybody else is having a much easier time than I am. Because when we look at how the other students in the classroom are performing, they seem to be having a much easier time. They don't struggle as much as I do. And it's not true, right? We all struggle a lot behind the scenes in our own ways. We're just not forthright about that because we have a competitive environment that teaches us to appear to be more perfect than we actually are, to show up polished, right? So taking opportunities to emphasize that would really help. And let me just check my notes real quick, make sure I'm not forgetting anything on this point. Yeah, I think I said it. Okay, good. And the other part is creating a safe to fail environment, right? Safe to fail is better than foolproof. So how can you create a more safe to fail environment? Well, failure is like actually an important part of learning. And how did you say it, Patrick? Like failure is the beginning.
First attempt in learning.
Failure is the first attempt in learning. Yeah. So it's really a necessary piece to learning, right? But for the fake imposter, learning is such a point, or failure is such a point of anxiety. It's something that to be avoided at all costs. So you want to break that mindset. And some ways that you can do that is using that formative process with drafts and feedback before submitting a final piece of work. So what do I mean by that? I mean that if you have a final paper due at the end of class, like don't just set that, have that paper stand by itself and then wait until the end of the class to have it due. And then, failures, like then it's like very high stakes, right? If you get a bad grade on that paper, you're going to do very poorly in the class. So that's setting things up to be very not safe to fail. Better is to break that up into smaller pieces, have those pieces turned in, and multiple opportunities for the instructor to provide feedback on that performance, and even better opportunities for peers to provide feedback on that performance. The bigger the audience, the more people that are seeing it, the more meaning it's going to take on. and the more you can build a community in your classroom, rather than, have learning as a shared experience rather than a very individualistic sort of thing. Move away from really high stakes tasks like timed exams, etc. Try to think about the value that we're trying to bring into the real world. What is the future of the workplace and what we're training people to do, and what skills are actually going to be valuable there. So we don't want to stress people out just for the sake of doing it, right? We want to have people to be stretched and challenged. And so what that means is we want good stress, use stress to come from the challenge of doing the task, but not stress in the term of distress, like where we provide opportunities for these fears and rumination to build. Providing some choice. So with multimodalities and literacies, I guess the multiliteracies is more to the future of the workplace and the university kind of thing. But in terms of, breaking the imposter cycle, I would say that just providing some of that choice in combination with those human dimensions to help people carve their path to learning in a way that's meaningful to them, so that they get out of this cycle of trying to please other people, doing what they think what the instructor to do or what other people will value, and getting to know themselves very well. And also get rid of the uncertainty, right? The more uncertainty, the worse. So be very, very transparent. If you want a certain something from your students, we see this a lot when it comes to like online discussions and stuff like that. We expect people to know what we want, but then we don't say it when we write the assignment instructions. So say exactly what you want, have very clear, easy to follow rubrics, and just take all the uncertainty out of it. Look for opportunities to check perfectionism. So this means having like early interventions, mini interventions, I would call it. And this is a point to where you, as the professor, you have to be very creative in how you do this, depending on the kind of class you have. If it's a big class with 300 people, you might have to break things into smaller groups and look for ways to do it. If you have a smaller class, you might have more opportunities for individual attention, even like check-ins with projects between you and the student can help. I'll tell you, in PFF, we're doing a model to where we're lucky to have a team. So, we're able to have some of our team members meet individually with each student every week. And that's a game changer, because you can get to know somebody on a personal level, understand the things that are going on with their lives, and spot these points and blockages, and work with that student to remove those blockages early on so that they have the best chance of being successful. And so I would love to hear about any strategies you might be able to come up with for these mini interventions. But we can all think of different challenges with the kinds of classes we're teaching that might make this difficult. But I would challenge us to not think about what makes it difficult, but to use these wonderful brains that we all have and think of creative ways, new interventions, new ways we can transform the way education is done to have more of these personal moments with our students and to check some of these blockages that people have. So we can set them up for the best chances of success, not just in our class, not just for the subject material, but throughout their academic career and in life. Setting clear, consider writing like course expectations and not just course policies. So course policies are something like, rules that we set, like no eating in the classroom, no using technology. We see like rules like that for our course policies. Nothing turned in past a certain point or you lose points. But write course expectations, because in your syllabus, you can you write whatever you want, right? You can set your own expectations. So you might say something in your syllabus and just change that mindset, change the way the course feels. Learning this course is a shared responsibility. Cooperation is highly valued, so please help each other. Avoid comparing yourself to your classmates. We only see what's on the surface, but understand that we all struggle in our own way. Perfectionism is discouraged. Please make a realistic evaluation of how much time others are spending reviewing your work compared to the amount of time and effort that you spend preparing your work. A good professional practice is to start with the least effort and expand where needed. Please evaluate your performance in this course based on what happens inside this course and not what has happened in the past. In this course, I want you to stretch yourself, so please leave any preconceived notions you have about your abilities that would make it more difficult at the door. I won't go through every one of them. This is an important one. If you're struggling, please talk about it or ask for help. Talk to me or access the campus resources listed in the syllabus, such as disability services, counseling services, etc. So actually write these sort of things in your syllabus to let your learners know what your expectations are for the course in terms of their well-being and health and how that relates to learning. Because I strongly believe well-being and academic rigor, academic achievement are not separate things. They're one and the same. The better your health is, the more you're going to be able to learn and take those healthy risks that are so important to develop as a human being. I want to have time for this. Why address this in higher education, early intervention, break the cycle, model human-centered leadership for people who go into society. Obviously, the imposter cycle can lead to burnout and dropout, loss of research talent. So we want to prevent that. And college management, we want people to choose the right majors and careers, especially when teaching undergraduate. All right, I want to go back to Patrick. Where's this slide?
Oh, it's okay. I need a slide, but
There you go.
that was
Yes.
fantastic. Yeah, I
Let's
think
talk
that's a really
about
good
more about
point.
that
Yeah,
impression management. Yeah.
really, really well said about creating a supportive environment where people feel comfortable supporting each other, right? And that ties right into impression management. So this notion that everybody is worried what other people think about them on some level, or have an idea of what other people think about them. And so what we're trying to do is mitigate the need where people are more comfortable dropping their guard once they have that all in the same boat mentality, to help them actually address their fears or dispel their fears. Because every student in the classroom, they have a goal. There's a reason they're there. There's a reason they want what they want, and that why they're studying what they're studying. And I think it's easy to forget that people, even though they want something, they forget necessarily why they want it. We get so caught up in all of the fears between us and what we want that it can prevent us from showing up as our best selves, best students. And so as professors, if you can think, like Jonathan just said, ways to help demystify the process for them, that's a big one. Find a way to check in with them regularly, whether it's during lecture, office hours, via email, finding ways to give a platform to check in, ask questions, vent. I remember when I was in graduate school, we had to do something called process recordings. And that was mandated. And basically what that was, it was literally processing our experience in the work we were doing, whether it was our field work, internships, the classroom. Also, he had mentioned portfolio. We kept portfolios about our classwork. And we had a lot of collaboration projects. And so all of those things help to facilitate breathing room to process what we were experiencing emotionally, not just checking the box, and to allow a learning environment that had room for mistakes, and to learn to fail fast. I love that diagram that was up there about fail safe environments, but it's also important to make room for people to learn to fail fast. Meaning that the quicker we get out of our head with a failure, the quicker we rebound and correct course. And so I think as a professor, being approachable will really help with those who are struggling with anxiety and perception and impression management. If they know that the professor is approachable, their peers are approachable, it'll foster that camaraderie. That's really in my opinion, the best type of learning environment. Not that everybody gets a medal, not that everybody gets a free pass, but rather that we can support each other, in our learning process. And it'll make a better use of everybody's time and the experience in graduate school in general, because that translates to the workforce. And it translates to what they're going to be doing career-wise after, and how to manage stress. So whatever you can do as a professor to help them understand that their experience in school, those skills translate to the workforce, not just the knowledge, but stress management, time management, transparency, camaraderie, all of those things will help correct whatever maladaptive perceptions they had going in. Because one thing we know about imposter syndrome is its origins. The narratives we learn growing up in the home, whether that was on the one side of the spectrum, the very rigid, high expectation household where the only validation you received was when you did a perfect job, or the very unorthodox background where there was no expectations and you had to be resilient, the resilient one, and find your way through it. It's very polarized. So if there is that type of narrative, that the students taking with them into graduate school, this is their chance to have a corrective experience with their professor, where there's a balance. Well, it's like, it's okay to make mistakes, but we also teach them how to fail fast and learn from them. But the only way that that's going to be identified, and you were asking, Linda, about how do we know if a client is struggling with imposter syndrome? The problem is we don't, because a big part of that is they've mastered impression management. They've mastered the art of doing what they need to do to get praised, but then, being quiet oftentimes the rest of the time, not taking what we consider socially acceptable risks. Now, this is different than what we see in like the, narcissists or perfectionists. They tend to be very good at not being transparent. And this is the interesting thing about people with imposter syndrome, is they are generally more transparent about their handicaps, but not to the people in authority, to their peers. And this is why it's really important to foster that camaraderie among the classmates, because they'll be transparent with each other more than they'll be transparent with the teacher, because of that strong desire for validation. And so learning to validate, but also check in, and in your lecturing, just being very repetitive about asking questions, and that failure is part of learning, and it's okay to not necessarily know or to get stuck. And if you feel stuck or something isn't registering, to talk about it. Maybe reserve some time after the lecture, or have mini check-ins during lecture, every 30 minutes, just taking 5 minutes every 30 minutes and saying, so we just covered X, Y, and Z. Any thoughts? Ask open-ended questions, prompt discussion for just a few minutes, and then you can resume the lecture. Just finding ways for engagement, I think, is the most important way to combat that impression management, because it'll get them outside of their head if you can get them talking. Does that make sense? Yeah. And we know this because we all experience this. The more we're allowed to kind of dwell in our head, the deeper into our insecurities we go, right? But if we get to talking openly about our thoughts and how we're feeling about class or the subject, or even the speaking of what we feel confident about in public, reinforces our esteem to perform. So it's kind of a win-win if we can, not that you can't have the whole lecture, obviously, being chit chat, but if it's constructive, bite sizes of feedback, I think that would be a huge win, for the classroom. Yeah.
And to Patrick's point, you may not know, but that's where universal design and learning comes in. Design your class in a way that helps to meet the needs of all students, not those that have traditionally made up the environment of higher education. And and a greater importance of that is non-traditional students now make up the majority of our college students. And we're really opening things up to more and more people, which makes it even more and more important that we deploy universal design and learning. And even by being here today, I know that all of you are very proactive about that. So that's great. At the university level, we can also, when it comes to college success workshops and committees and stuff like that, that we're serving in, time management is great. That's needed. But, opportunities for impression management and talking about imposter syndrome are important too. And let's move our prestige in university away from just being about academic rigor and also to being about how healthy and happy our students are. So I shared some links. You have Patrick's information. And I want to open to have more opportunity for discussion, but we are running out of time. So let me just launch this poll real quick, because this will help us to know how helpful this webinar was to you. If you enjoyed it, if you didn't, what sorts of things you would like to see us do in the future. We would really appreciate it if you can just take a moment. Let me do the final plugs. Our upcoming webinars, we have one on integrating open education resources. So this is going to be by Jennifer Beamer. She's a publishing specialist here at the university. She works at the library, and she's very informative. She's done some professional development stuff with us in the past and can tell you a lot about open publishing. Shamini Diaz, the director, will be co-hosting that. So highly encourage you to attend. It will be a great one for your own professional development. And we also have Shamini, director of the Preparing Future Faculty program, teaching in non-classroom spaces. So we have a lot of students at this university who are not going in traditional classroom teaching roles, but are doing things like health education, organizational behavior, and these other kinds of leadership positions where design thinking, systems thinking is still very important. And a lot of what we teach in PFF is very applicable. So I highly encourage you to attend that. Please join us on LinkedIn. It's called Ethical Pedagogy Community. We're growing very fast. This screenshot says 100 members. We're up to 200 members now. And the link is in the chat. I'll go ahead and post the links there again. There we go. And that this is a great community because we have a lot of alumni that have gone on and or working at universities all over the country. And so they post opportunities, and it's great to engage and help each other in our journeys. Yep, some of these links I already shared, so check them out. Okay, so at this point, we're over the hour, so I'm just going to stop sharing. Feel free to leave and feel free to stay. I'm going to hang out in case anybody wants to discuss further.